Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Welcome. Good to see you all on Zoom. Those of you who are here on Zoom, welcome to those of you on Facebook. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Tonight, we have the honor of having with us Professor and Dr. Heather Allansdottir for a very interesting discussion, I believe, on human rights and Judaism. So I want to thank Dr. Heather so much for joining us this evening. It's an absolute pleasure to have you with us.
Likewise, thank you.
This is very exciting for me, this discussion, this conversation. I know that we'll get very many interesting perspectives from our human rights lawyer. And there is also a tremendous amount that Judaism brings to the table. So I'm going to do my best to bring Torah perspectives to this conversation. At the end, we'll have a question and answer session as well. So if you have questions along the way, please jot it down, drop it into the comments at the end or as we go along. And those of you who are on Zoom, there'll be an opportunity to do some live questions as well at the end. So without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Heather to take the lead with this conversation. And let's see where it goes and let's see where it takes us. Thank you, Heather.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the lovely introduction, Rabbi Avi, and thank you so much, everyone, for attending this lecture. I think it's going to be very stimulating and dynamic discussion. And I'm very excited to be part of this, bringing together these different bodies of knowledges and seeing what themes they have and what commonalities they have. And I think that we can all kind of learn a lot from each other in this. Just to briefly explain my background, since I know most of you already know Rabbi Avi. I'm a faculty member here at the university in Iceland, and I'm an academic of human rights law and also of comparative constitutional law. I'm British and Australian, so I'm not a qualified lawyer in Iceland. So I'm not the person to call if you've got a legal question about the Icelandic legal system, although I find it very fascinating. I came here partly to study the constitution drafting process of the last 10 years. So Icelandic law is also very interesting to me. But I generally work as an academic on ideas of justice and different conceptions of what freedom is, and also the history of human rights. I'm very interested in how human rights developed in law as a concept, especially after 1948, and to what extent that was bound up with historical trajectories of that time. So I hope that's part of the discussion that we'll get into. There's one way of thinking of human rights as them being the principles of never again. It's saying, like, whatever else we think of one another, we do not commit the atrocities of the Holocaust against one another. That's one way of conceptualizing human rights. That's very kind of close to my heart. So we'll get into these different ideas of what justice means and what it means to have a right. There's one kind of point to start with that I thought would be the most obvious, like, intersection of the Venn diagrams between human rights law on the one hand and Judaism on the other, which I'd like to pose to Rabbi Avi, which is that this is me speaking from my background in human rights law and being much less anchored in the Torah and Halakha as you are, but whether you would say that human rights are the Noahide covenants by another name, or to what extent it's meaningful that human rights overlap with the Noahide laws. There's something very interesting in the study of in human rights academia that says these are really pan-cultural values. Like, every culture kind of says, don't kill, don't rape, don't steal, and whether human rights are just a reformulation of the Noahide covenant. So I'd love to hear what you think of that idea.
Thank you, Dr. Heather. Thank you for your words. Great introduction and a great question. So are the 7 universal laws, the 7 Noahide laws, is that like the human rights version of is that the human rights of the Torah?
Yeah.
And the short answer, I would say, I think in a few moments, I'll take the opportunity to list some of them so we could remind ourselves what they are and what we're talking about. But in short, I would say that these 7 Noahide laws are the most fundamental. And if we think about it like this, imagine what would the world be like if everybody kept these 7 Noahide laws. So this is not necessarily all of what the Torah has to say about protecting people and human rights and things like that. But this is certainly a tremendous beginning and a very fundamental beginning. Imagine what the world would look like if everybody kept these 7. And I should probably list them.
Yeah.
At least quickly. We could probably go into some of them more in detail as we move through this conversation. But these are very general, obviously. These 7 are very general. And they, of course, include many details and many subcategories as well. So just to list the 7 Noahide laws or the 7 universal laws. So number 1 is believing in one God. So basically to acknowledge that there is one single God. And not only that, he cares about what is going on in the world. He cares about what we do. And he desires that we take care of the world and that we do what's right. Number 2, do not curse God. Okay, it's pretty straightforward. Number 3, do not murder. Life is sacred. Every person is an entire world. No life could be measured. Every life is priceless. And somebody who destroys a life is in fact destroying an entire world. And on the other side, if somebody saves a life, they are saving and sustaining an entire universe. Number 4 is do not rip off a limb off a living animal. So the idea is to respect animals, actually all of God's creatures, and not to cause them any unnecessary pain. Number 5 is do not steal. Number 6 is do not commit adultery. The family unit is the foundation of a human society. And number 7, the final one, is to establish courts of law. So of course, these are very general. What I would say is, imagine if everybody kept these 7. Imagine there was no stealing, there was no killing. There were courts of justice that were completely just in every country, in every society, in every community. And what would the world look like? I would like to point out something very interesting, kind of very powerful perspective, in a way going back to the beginning to answer a fundamental question and to understand what is really the basic understanding of human rights in the Torah. So this is more of a general idea. So I'd like to take the opportunity to say it right now in the beginning. And that is that although the Torah has all types of protections for people, for all people, and we just listed 7 of the most fundamental, you will not find, if you read the entire Torah, go through the entire book, the entire 5 books of Moses, you will not find the term human rights. You won't find it in the Torah, you won't find it in the Talmud, you won't find it in any of the most important commentaries and explanations. So what's the reason for that? And the answer is that the Torah does not give rights to people. Instead, the Torah gives responsibilities. So Jewish law talks about responsibilities that we have to our fellow person. So for example, employers have certain responsibilities to their employees. Employees have certain responsibilities to their employers. Neighbors have responsibilities to each other. A husband has responsibilities to his wife. A woman has responsibilities to her husband. So instead of it being, my rights, what I deserve, it's about my responsibility and what I'm here for. What is my responsibility? What is the service that I need to provide? And most of the time, there is not a tremendous difference between, calling it rights or calling it responsibilities. But in fact, there are practical differences, so much so that the differences could have drastic ramifications. And I'd like to give an example just to show the perspective of the Torah of this idea that it's not about my rights, but it's about my responsibilities. So say you're driving down the highway one day, and all of a sudden you witness an accident in front of you or on the side of the highway. Someone is stuck in the car, and of course, every minute is critical, to save the person's life. You wait an extra minute, it might be too late. The thing is that you're driving in your car and you're in a hurry. So you have an important meeting or something that you need to hurry to, and it's not really the right time for you to go and help people. The question is, do you have a legal obligation to stop and help that person? So of course, everyone would agree that the moral thing to do and the right thing to do and the noble thing to do would be to stop and help. But the question is there a legal obligation to stop and help, or at least to stop and call an ambulance, call the police, so that someone else could take care of this person who is in tremendous danger and tremendous risk? And the bottom line is that in modern societies, there aren't any laws that obligate a person to help, at least not until fairly recently. I think Dr. Heather could probably comment on this, tell us a little bit more about this. But in most cases, secular law here in this example, it falls short of most people's moral standard. Now, in Judaism, it's completely different. It's not a system of rights, it's a system of responsibility. I'm responsible for my fellow person. And so there is a very clear and a very important commandment to go ahead and save that person, to do whatever you could. Now, of course, there are exceptions to the rule. What if there'll be a financial loss? Or what if there'll be a certain risk to your life? Are you still required? So of course there are some exceptions, but that's the key. There are exceptions to the rule, but the rule is that you have a responsibility for others, and you're obligated to stop and help that person. So in a rights-based society, I have my rights, you have your rights, but your problem is your problem. So if I'm a nice guy, I could stop and help, but not necessarily am I obligated to go out of my way to help you. And I think that it's no coincidence that the Talmud has a very interesting phrase, and it says like this: I was created. The Talmud is talking about why we came into this world. So the Talmud says, I was created to serve God. So immediately you see it's not about rights. It's not about me. It's about my responsibility to others. It's my responsibility to the world. It's my responsibility to God.
Okay. Do you mind if I respond quickly?
Please go ahead.
Yeah, it's really interesting to kind of turn it on its head like that. And I really like this idea of the idea of the duty to not be a bystander in human rights. So that's quite interesting. We're talking about the regular law of nation states. You're right, it is much more recent, and you could sue somebody for negligence or this kind of thing. But you're right, you have no obligation to, for instance, report something that you've seen if you're not the kind of direct victim of the crime. But one thing where this idea of having a duty to speak out, even when it's not directly happening to you, has actually come up a lot, is in Holocaust studies. I wrote my first thesis on Holocaust or Shoah, whichever term it preferred me to use, historiography, which is where you start to get this idea of the bystander. And I think that this is actually a very powerful idea. And I'm not saying this in contradiction to you. I'm saying kind of agreeing with the values underpinning what you're saying, that we have moral duties to not be bystanders. In Holocaust historiography, there's this tripartite definition of victims, perpetrators, and bystanders, and to be a bystander is an unethical position, to stand by in the face of someone else witnessing injustice. And I think that it's a very good way of conceptualizing the interdependence of our lives, right? Rather than this very atomized idea, like I have my rights and my freedom, and so just don't interfere with me and I won't interfere with you, because human life isn't like that. And maybe that's something very valuable about a lot of the values in the Torah, is that it recognizes the interdependence of people. And I think that's really lovely. I thought it was really great when you go through the Noahide covenants, and obviously there are some, it would be so interesting to map it out. We probably wouldn't be the first people in the world to do it, but to map out the ones that converge completely, sort of to specific articles in, for instance, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and ones which are not there at all and are very conspicuously not there. For instance, anything to do with God, right? That's not in any text of international human rights law. The texts of international human rights law are secular, and that they get into very interesting conversation about how can you hold these values without it being underpinned by a concept of a God. And that's a very interesting conversation. The one that I find so interesting, this is me just being like a legal nerd, is the idea that in the Noahide covenants, the commandment to establish a system of law. I find that so interesting, and that's a kind of a command that that Jews and non-Jews alike must follow. And I think that's really great to thread in the idea of like, well, look, we live in societies with one another, we share social space with one another. How are we going to devise the rules of the game so that we can kind of be fair with one another? It kind of led me to want to ask you something, and I hope I'm phrasing this correctly, because there's I don't want to draw upon kind of a cliche or a trope, but it's to do with the tradition of Judaism, not Judaism actually, but people who are Jewish, who are working in the law. I need to put through the stereotype, the Jewish lawyer, although I am wearing my collar in honor of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, so I have great respect for many Jewish legal thinkers and judges. But I was wondering whether, how to phrase it, firstly, like, is it, first, I guess there's two questions that I'd like to kind of separate out, but they're linked. One is it okay, or is it ethical, is it all right for a Jewish person who is observing the laws of Torah to become a lawyer or a judge? That's sort of my first question. And secondly, like, is it good? Is it a mitzvah? Is it actually like is it kind of a way of honoring God if one of the Noahide covenants is to establish rules of law? So I guess those are my two questions I'd like to kind of follow up.
That's a great question. That's a great question, Heather. Thank you. Lawyers, law is definitely a very Jewish job.
I didn't want to bring that up in a stereotype way, but but there's also such an incredible tradition there, right, of such amazing thinkers.
There are certainly a tremendous amount of jokes about the Jewish lawyers and the Jewish doctors. Why is it that it's such a Jewish profession? There are probably many reasons. One that comes to mind might be because of the amount of study that Jewish people were doing, especially with the Talmud, for example. So the Talmud is really Jewish law. And so in Judaism and in yeshiva, we're always studying, and studying is a lifelong journey. It's not something that you stop when you finish school. And so there's always been a tremendous emphasis on study especially Jewish law. And Talmud really sharpens the mind, and it really takes you through the debates and the whole process, the thinking of how the law came to be. So that might be one reason. I don't know for sure, but it's certainly, I would say I would think that it's a good thing for someone to stand up to help someone who needs to be represented in a court of justice, and to try to play a part and help that justice should be served. So it sounds like there are a lot of good things about it, and I'm sure there are many other reasons why. Historically, it's become a very Jewish job, but I wouldn't say it's a mitzvah.
Okay.
It's not, it wouldn't be one of the 613 mitzvahs, but certainly one of the 7 Noahide laws is to set up courts of justice. And that's really the main mitzvah, that there should be a system. There should be a system. So if somebody participates in that system, they're participating in the mitzvah. I saw on the news recently, maybe a few months ago, maybe a year ago, I don't remember, there's an Orthodox woman, Jewish Orthodox woman, who became a judge in Brooklyn, if I'm not mistaken. So I thought that was very interesting. But I'd like to go back to something you mentioned before, comparing the 7 Noahide laws to the human rights, to the whole list of human rights. And you mentioned the first one about belief in God. And right here you have a difference between human rights and the seven Noahide laws, where the first one of the 7 Noahide laws is serving God. And I'd like to point out that in a way that is probably the key to all of the 7 Noahide laws. So it's not just one of them, but in a way that one commandment is really the key to all of them. And the reason is, I'll tell you what the Rambam says, Maimonides, who lived about 1,000 years ago, and I have the text in front of me. He lists, he talks a lot about the 7 Noahide laws, perhaps more than other commentaries. It's not so much, but more than other commentaries. And he says like this, if someone, okay, I'm just going to paraphrase. If someone keeps the 7 Noahide laws, not because God said so, only because it makes sense, so of course it's a good thing, but they're not from the righteous of the nations. Maimonides says that anyone could be righteous by keeping these 7 Noahide laws. So Judaism believes that you don't need to be Jewish to be good. All you need to do is be a good person, whoever you are, and keep these 7 Noahide laws. But the Rambam says, Maimonides says that to be righteous, to be from the righteous of the nations, you need to do these mitzvahs not only because they make sense, but also because God said so. And in a way, this is key. This goes back to the first one, which is belief in one God. And why would the Rambam say this? Why is this important to Maimonides? What's the idea behind this? And the idea is that we need God and we need the Torah as a moral compass. So absolute morality could only be from God. If it's without God, in a way, theoretically, you could say it's a matter of opinion. That's why in different societies, there'll be different morals and ethics. Sometimes they'll just be different. Sometimes they'll even be conflicting. They'll have some conflicting ideas about what is moral and what is ethical. So to have absolute morality that's not subject to opinion, that is from God, that is from the Torah. Now, most people make moral choices. Most people are good people. Most people are ethical and moral. So you might ask, what do we really need absolute morality? Why is that so important? And the idea is, the reason why the Rambam, Maimonides, makes this, emphasizes this and makes this such a central point, is because if somebody does these mitzvahs, somebody follows these laws only because they make sense and because they're accepted by society and because they're popular, all of that could change. Society could change, what's popular could change, and people could be blinded by other factors. People could be swayed for any number of reasons. So it's not to say that if somebody reads the Torah and keeps the Torah, that's a guarantee that every choice that they make will be a moral choice. But the fact is that having God and the Torah as a moral compass is certainly an extra layer of protection for our morals and for our values. Chances are you'll be more careful with them if you know that it's about an objective truth and not just about what's, what was recently passed in the government. Without God and without the Torah, it's perhaps a little bit easier to be manipulated. So in a way, this is an extra protection, and we don't have to look too far in history. Just in the 20th century, Nazi Germany is an excellent example of what happens when you only follow the laws because they make sense. It's very easy to make up reasons and make up excuses why they don't apply in certain cases and for certain people. And so even if the world never goes back to a time, and hopefully it never will, goes back to, even if it doesn't go back to a time where you have an entire government, turning on its people in that way. But this is also relevant for individuals, right? So what if an individual has a certain opportunity to do something and they believe that their action will never be known by anyone else? What if they know that some action that they take against a person, they'll never be held accountable for it, right? So someone who does it not only because it makes sense, but also because they believe in the Torah and God, that is certainly an extra protection. And this is not just about the big picture. It's not just about the governments. It's not just about the world. But it's an individual. It's a very individual. Every single day we have opportunities and we make choices, and we hope that the choices that we make are the moral ones and the ethical ones.
Yeah, that is it. Can I come in now?
Please go ahead.
That was really great explanation. That was really covered so much. Just to apologize, with my connection cut out on my computer. Sorry, I missed a little part. I'm now on my phone, but I hope you can all still hear and see me clearly. There is so much in that, but one thread in particular led me to links in with the next thing that I kind of wanted to get on with and discuss, and one of the things I was thinking about for a while, which is, you mentioned living in a system of government where the laws are unjust, and something I've often kind of had an inner struggle with a lot when I was a student was, well, I'm studying law because my father raised me to go and be a good person, but also there have been these awful systems of governance where injustice was legal, right? The Nuremberg laws being the most striking one, or apartheid, or the Jim Crow laws. There's many systems of injustice that are embedded into law. And this sort of leads me to what I really wanted to think of the different threads of this, because I don't know the answer of what you would say. So I'm really keen to discuss this with you, is basically what the Torah would say about civil disobedience.
rights. And to kind of draw this out a bit more, one of the things I used to lecture on actually in Moscow was very specifically the right to protest, as enshrined in international human rights law. So the human right to freedom of assembly and to and freedom of association. And it's obviously a very topical conversation. What do we mean by protest? I imagine that's what we'll kind of get down to within this. But on the one hand, I thought, we have this idea of, healing the world, of tikkun olam, of being somebody who rights the wrongs of the world, and that being, a mitzvah. And so when you see injustice, you should speak out against it. But on the other hand, I'm not, from my limited understanding of the Torah, I know there is the principle that the law of the land is the law, right? And I know you've discussed this elsewhere. And I was wondering whether there's a tension between those two. If the law of the land is the law, and I'm living under a system of injustice, is it A, right for me to resist it? Can I? And B, should I? Like, is it actually part of a mitzvah, or, firstly, to kind of pursue justice, and also to kind of redress the injustice? And what are the boundaries of that? So is it that you can protest, but only within the boundaries of the existing law, even though you want to overthrow that law? So for instance, I think you'll have the civil rights movement in America in the mid 20th century. And I apologize, I'm not a scholar of American legal history, but I know that they used a lot of really interesting, innovative tactics, like the NAACP, for, on the one hand, doing really grassroots, kind of on the ground activism, and then on the other hand, being very strategic in like, what cases are we going to bring to like the Supreme Court? And through judicial activism is how they managed to overturn a lot of these unjust laws, to establish better equality in the law. And I was wondering what you think. What is the kind of correct approach to living under a system of injustice according to the Torah? Whether it's something as extreme as, living under something incredibly oppressive like the Nuremberg laws, or just living in a country that passes some laws that kind of still hurt people and harm people. Like, what should we do about that?
That's a great question, and you're absolutely correct that one of the most important rules in the Torah and in the Talmud is that the law of the land is the law. Now, of course, at the same time, Judaism believes that we have to stand up for what's right, and that's part of our responsibility, to stand up for what's right in general, and also for people who are not able to make their own voice heard, for people who are not able, people who are needy, people who don't have their necessities met, and in whatever area it might be, it's up to us to stand up for what's right. Now, of course, the law of the land is the law. Whatever action we take must be within the framework of what's legal, and what's allowed in that system, what's permissible, and what is and the right way to do it. So whether it's protesting in a peaceful way, or whether it's taking certain legal action, bringing cases to the courts and things like that, that is very Jewish idea, to stand up for what's right, and to stand up for justice. But I would say the key is to respect the law of the land, and not to go against whatever law whatever laws are relevant to that situation. And in general, it's a very Jewish idea, tikkun olam, to make this world a better place, to look after the people who need help, and to give opportunities to people who need it, to make this world a better place, a kinder place, a more just place, and ultimately a more godly place. So I would say this is a very Jewish idea, to stand up for what's right. Now, if we look into Jewish history, we don't find that Jews have been, doing lots of protests and challenging governments and things like that, or even teaching the 7 Noahide laws. You don't find, even if you look through many of the commentaries and many of the scholars and sages throughout history, there is very little talk, almost zero, about the 7 Noahide laws. Certainly not about teaching it, spreading it, and explaining it and trying to influence others in that regard. And I think the answer is quite obvious. Historically, the Jewish people were either being persecuted or they were just happy to be left alone. So Jewish people mostly did not have the opportunity, and they did not have the luxury, to get out there and make themselves heard and cause waves in that way. If life was good for the Jews, they weren't necessarily going to rock the boat too much. So perhaps this is the reason why Jews are not necessarily known for being the biggest protesters. And also, Jews historically have not been teaching and spreading awareness of the 7 Noahide laws. I think that they were probably concerned that would create backlash. Now, in recent times, the Lubavitcher Rebbe not only talked about this, not only talked about the 7 Noahide laws, but he encouraged everyone who has the ability to publicize these teachings, these laws, so that the world could become a better place and reach a place of peace and a place of kindness and a better world, a place where God and godliness could be part of society. And a big part of this, of course, is the 7 Noahide laws. And we're very lucky today to live in a free world, at least in most of the world. And today we finally have the opportunity to be able to make our voices heard. And so, of course, whether it's the 7 Noahide laws to raise awareness and to try to influence positive change and these moral and ethical values, whether it's that or whether it's standing up for some other injustice, it should be done. It should be done within the law, because the law of the land is the law. But I would say that that's a pretty Jewish idea.
Great. Thank you so much. That's really interesting. Yeah, and it does make sense, to operate within those frameworks, then still to resist. So you're still honoring that the law of the land is the law, but resisting to say that you want justice. And one thing to hop, and this isn't me, I'm not trying to set international human rights law in opposition to Judaism, because what's so interesting in these conversations is the overlap. But one thing that I kind of use to kind of be like, okay, well, why do I work on international human rights law, is that this is actually kind of in a way like a handy mechanism for these things. If a nation bans something, but it's now enshrined in international human rights law, then you still have, so I mean, I don't want to get too much into politics, but let's say, I was teaching protest law in Russia, where there's lots of restrictions, and Navalny is in the news today. There's this idea, well, in international human rights law, they're a tool, and I think that we should all know this. I think it's very helpful for us all to know that, like, if your country is doing something that's unjust, remember there is this whole other kind of body that you can go to, where these things have all been set out. To say if those laws are wrong, we can then kind of draw upon these. And actually, I think with the construction of international human rights law as a system of law, as a body of law, with the creation of the UN system and in 1948, and Eleanor Roosevelt being very involved in getting all the national signatories to this, it was this kind of idea of like, well, if your country passes something like Nuremberg laws. If your country passes something that is brutalizing and dehumanizing and degrading to some citizens, that they should have recourse outside of that country to draw upon these tools. And that's kind of how human rights emerge. So that I think that makes sense. So then within the boundaries of international human rights law, you can be recognizing, respecting those laws. So I thought that's, yeah, it's the very kind of interesting commonalities here. I have something, this will link up, but it may take a while for it to all make sense, is to do with what we've been talking through with this idea of rights and this idea of responsibilities, which I find so interesting, because I do a lot of work on children's rights. And with that, there's this very interesting dynamic of, well, the child has the rights and therefore other people have to have responsibilities in order for those rights to be properly like ensured and secured. And one thing that's very interesting about international human rights law is that it's grounded in these two covenants rather than one. It's not in one text, it's not in one list, it's actually in two, which is to do with very interesting historical reasons in the aftermath of the Second World War. One is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and one is the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And the way that I kind of explain this to my students is one of those is the leave me alone rights, and the other one is the please help me rights. And throughout the 20th century, this was this big kind of chasm. On the one hand, you had it because it was about Cold War dynamics, basically. So the leave me alone rights are very, let's say, like American or liberal kind of, I have a right to freedom of expression, I have a right to privacy, you know, I'm free in the extent to which I'm not interfered with. And that's one way of conceiving of freedom. And the other way of conceiving of freedom is that you would be kind of empowered or emancipated through initiatives that require a much more interventionist approach, like building hospitals, building schools. Then you have good hospitals and you have good schools and you have running clean water, and therefore you're more free. As a little footnote, the person who wrote all this out, these two ways of thinking about rights was Isaiah Berlin, who was of Jewish descent, who founded Wilson, and he did a lot of work with Hannah Arendt, this other great, you know, of course, like Jewish thinker of justice. But what I thought was really interesting, the way that we're talking through how you said, like, Judaism instead has this concept of responsibility rather than rights. Would you say that Judaism is more collectivist than a lot of our understanding of rights, which are quite individual? Like, I have my right to freedom of expression, I have my right to protest, I have my right to privacy. And Judaism, the like halakha is more like seeing the world as a kind of cat's cradle in which we all have these corresponding rights and responsibilities to one another, so we can all coexist. Like, if you pull this thread, it's going to hurt me, and we have to be conscious of this person and that person, and that Judaism is more collectivist in that way. Do you think that's a helpful way to think of it?
I would say it's probably a combination of the two. Again, the Torah doesn't talk about people's rights at all. It's always the responsibility. It doesn't talk about the freedoms that you have, the freedom of speech and freedom of movement, and a freedom to pursue life, liberty, and happiness. You know, the Torah doesn't use that language. So, for example, when it comes to freedom of speech, right? So the Torah only goes to the things that you shouldn't be saying, right? So it doesn't say that you're allowed to say whatever you want and you have freedom of speech. The Torah doesn't do that at all. What the Torah does is give certain, it goes straight to your responsibility. There are certain things that you're not allowed to say. And some of the things that you're not allowed to say include speaking badly about someone else, even if it's true. You shouldn't be speaking badly about someone else. Also, just gossiping. It might not be bad, it might not be good. Gossip. So that's also something that you shouldn't be saying. Now, of course, there are exceptions to every rule, but again, that's the key. The key is that there are exceptions. So for example, if whatever story this is might cause financial harm or physical harm to someone, then of course you have an obligation to share with the appropriate people. But you see how the Torah goes straight to the responsibility aspect. The Torah goes straight to the things that you need to do, or that you shouldn't be doing for others, because you need to protect their privacy and their reputation and their name. But in terms of what the Torah looks after, what it doesn't look after, it's really a very wide range. I'd probably say that it's a combination. And another thing I would say is that the Torah leaves many things up to the society and to the community and to the courts. So the Torah doesn't get involved with every issue, but the Torah gets involved where it feels that it should. But many things it leaves up to the community, and there are certain rules about things that the community could do, certain things that the community cannot do, how it should be done, how it could be done, and things like that. So I wouldn't really attach these protections that the Torah gives to either one of these bodies or either one of these paths.
Sure. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And it's a really interesting kind of tension, but I find it this very interesting dynamic between there's civil and political rights on the one hand, my leave me alone rights, like I have freedom of expression, and economic, social and cultural rights. The other, like I have a right to housing, I have a right to education, which require, someone's got to provide that, who's going to build that school, who's going to build that hospital. So that then requires more state intervention and much less kind of libertarian approach. And actually kind of in the last sort of 20-30 years, there's been a very great development in bridging these two conversations after the end of the Cold War, which was also in large part done by, I don't know if any of you have heard the philosopher Martha Nussbaum, who was very working with Amartya Sen, the economist. She's also Jewish and also a great philosopher, but she working on how in a way you have to secure all rights, or all of these core rights, for any one of them to be meaningful. And that's also how I kind of think of like the Noahide covenants. Like you can't pick and mix, right? You can't kind of say, oh, well, it's fine because I haven't, torn a limb off a live animal, so I go. You have to kind of hold all of these at once for any of it to be meaningful. Otherwise, it's not a kind of coherent way of being in the world. And this led me to this, my last question, really briefly. This idea, much of the Noahide covenants, I feel, are underpinned by a concept of dignity. And you've mentioned this idea with here and elsewhere of like life being of human being of value because it's God creation. So God kind of created it, and so we must honor it. And I think there is this concept in international human rights law, but it's not underpinned by the idea that people are created by God. And I realize that is ultimately kind of the tension between international human rights law on the one hand and Judaism or halakha on the other, is that international human rights law is not underpinned by the idea that humans have inherent value because they're created by, but not because of their creator, they just have inherent value. And I can understand how that, you could sort of, okay, what does that pin to in the end? And I do understand that debate, but what it raises for me, which I find really interesting, is this concept of dignity, right? And I feel that both international human rights law and the principles of Judaism say that every individual person has inherent value, and you mustn't instrumentalize them. You shouldn't like use them to an end. You shouldn't ever interact with another person as a cipher. You should never see them as a symbol, or sacrifice them to a larger ideal, because each human has inherent worth. Do you think that that's a kind of commonality between international human rights law and Judaism, that idea of our right to dignity and our inherent value?
Definitely, that is a very Jewish idea, and that's sourced in the Torah. all over the Torah in many different forms, and in the Talmud and many other places. And I'll just share some of these ideas and some of these sources. And the first I'd start with would be the creation of people and of the first people, Adam and Eve. And what it says is that they were created in God's image. So that tells you a lot about human beings and about the respect that we all deserve, because we were all created the same way, and we're all created in God's image. Another famous one is love your fellow as yourself. And the way the Talmud puts it, don't do to others what you wouldn't want done to you. So you want to be treated with respect and dignity, and you want to, have certain rights and be treated fairly. And that is exactly how we need to treat others. So love your fellow as yourself. You love yourself, and you feel that for yourself, you should have these protections, these rights, and this dignity and this respect. The same is for others. What you wouldn't want done to you, don't do to others. I just like to point out, I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but we should keep in mind, I think it's a very good idea to keep in mind that the Torah is more than 3,000 years old. It's about 3,300 years old. So that's probably way before anybody was talking about human rights. I think that's something very powerful. And in terms of dignity and respect and treating people well, and not disrespecting people, and not insulting them and things like that. I'll just mention a couple of interesting laws, and that is that, for example, if somebody was a good person, but then they took a bad path and they became a sinner, and then they turn their life around, and they once again become righteous and they become good. So it's actually forbidden to remind such a person of their past sins and their past deeds, because that's embarrassing for them. That is, you're shaming them, even if it's in private. You're really making them feel awful. Another example of somebody converted to Judaism, and of course, anyone who truly wants to convert to Judaism is welcome. Such a person, you're not allowed to remind them of their past life, because perhaps that would make them embarrassed. That would make them feel uncomfortable. Maybe they're trying to integrate into the community, and they don't want people talking about the fact that they have a different background, and that could make somebody feel very bad. So these are some of the laws that the Torah talks about, and this just shows how important it is in the Torah to speak with respect, to treat people with respect, not to say something that could harm them emotionally, certainly not physically, psychologically. So the Torah is very sensitive to all of this. Any other ideas you wanted to discuss?
On my part, that was it, and I think that's nicely brought us up to the hour as well. But no, I think this has been really, really great. But I don't have any other questions, so it'd be great to just we can now open it up to the floor, to the question and answers. If anyone on the Zoom call has any questions. Avi, do you want to be the moderator, to be the one that lets them?
I just want to take this opportunity to give you a tremendous thank you for joining us. This was a wonderful discussion. I really enjoyed it. I hope everyone else did. And who knows, maybe we could continue, part 2 to this conversation. Let's see what happens. But thank you so much for coming. And I'm going to turn off the Facebook Live, so if anybody wants to be off the record, if anybody wants a little bit of privacy, but we'll open it up for questions and answers. Whoever wants to say something, please go ahead. And I guess both Dr. Heather and myself will I guess make some comments and try to answer some of your questions. So thank you again, everyone, for coming, and thank you, Heather, for joining us and making this so interesting and so fascinating.